Just 22% of voters trust the feds to do the right thing most of the time. And not only are voters distrustful and skeptical themselves, most believe that their fellow voters, their neighbors, are too trusting of the government. On top of that, most Republicans believe that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election, and most Democrats believe that Hillary Clinton was a legitimate winner in 2016. You know, if you put all that together, only about 1 out of every 4 voters believe the correct person was declared the winner in both of those presidential elections. And by the way, barring a landslide, it's virtually certain to happen again. The losing team in 2024 will think their candidate was robbed. Now, it's really hard to overstate just how serious a crisis of legitimacy this is for our government and for our nation. After all, the nation was founded on the belief that governments derive their only just authority from the consent of the governed. So what does that mean? If the government does not have the trust of voters over a long period of time, several decades, it does not have the legitimate authority needed to solve difficult challenges. Whether it's healthcare, crime, border security, or runaway government spending, lasting reform is impossible without trust in the legitimacy of our government. So, what can we do about it? The first step is to acknowledge the reality that this has been a problem for a very long time. It didn't start with COVID. It didn't start with the election of Donald Trump. It didn't start with Obamacare. In fact, it didn't even begin in the 21st century. It has been more than 50 years since voters trusted the federal government most of the time. And what this means is it's not Republicans or Democrats who are to blame. It's not conservatives or progressives. The problem is we have a very badly broken political system. With that, the second step you need to take is to recognize voters are not the problem. It is the behavior of the federal government that has created this crisis of legitimacy. So the real question quickly becomes, what must the government do to earn the trust of the American people? Well, the answer to that question is strikingly simple to state, and it's extraordinarily difficult to implement. It's not about new transparency laws or new rules on lobbying or government ethics. The only way for the federal government to regain the trust of the American people is to be more responsive to voters. Now, let's face it, that's the way our government is supposed to work. The voters are supposed to be in charge. And there's a lot of steps we could take to get there. One would be shifting power from the federal government to state and local governments. You know, that would help because those governments are closer to the people. So would making government regulators more accountable. Let's impose some checks and balances on their decision-making process. The problem, though, is that politically obsessed elites don't want to make the government more responsive. They reject our nation's founding ideals. They, in some sense, believe they should be empowered to rule over the rest of us. You know, it's not government of, by, and for the people. In their view, it should be government of and by the experts, and that'll be good for everybody else. This elitist attitude is the root cause of our broken political system. It is the reason that hardly anyone trusts the federal government. The good news? Well, the vast majority of Americans continue to embrace those noble founding ideals of freedom, equality, and self-governance. To restore trust in our government and to move America forward, the most important thing we can do is defeat the elitists and put the voters back in charge. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're right. The whole idea of having government closer to the local level instead of at the federal level does give people a sense of control and trust because you know the folks. You know you can kick them out pretty quickly, too.
Well, you know the folks. You know, if you're in a small town, you run into the mayor when you're grocery shopping or
and
something.
at bingo.
But there's another factor to it as well, and we don't think about this very often, but it's called voting with your feet. You know, if you don't like your local town, the way things are going, well, you probably want to stay there for nostalgia reasons, but eventually, if you say, I've had enough, you can move to another town. That's a very important part of it. And then with the whole idea of government regulation, The checks and balances are such a fundamental part of our system. It seems outrageous to people that a bureaucrat can make a rule without having anybody approve it.
Because it's blanket. It's a blanket rule,
Right.
as if every state is the same or every state has the same issues as the one next to it. Very different.
Right. But the overall attitude, we can talk all day about details and individual, rules or projects or shifts, but it really is a battle between the elitist world who think they should make decisions on a top-down basis and the vast majority of Americans who say, no, we believe in those founding ideals and the people are supposed to be in charge. We've talked a lot in the last couple of weeks about the elite 1%. This is a group that has a postgraduate degree, they live in a densely populated urban area, and they make more than $150,000 a year.
So smart, city, rich.
Right. And they make up about 1% of the country, but they are extraordinarily influential. They trust the government. They know the government officials.
And the others?
Well, if you take a look at a different group, people that don't have a postgraduate degree, people that don't live in a densely populated urban area.
And maybe not
They certainly,
too rich.
That's correct. They don't make that much money. Well, what's amazing about this group is they represent about 76% of voters.
Wow. Huge chunk. You don't hear
Huge
about.
chunk. You don't hear about them because nobody listens to them. This is the group that is saying, why won't our government listen? Only about 9% of them think their own congressman would take them seriously on an issue they cared about.
So what are their issues?
Well, they have some of the basic things we've been talking about trust and other issues with the government, starting with on Main Street, only 19% trust the federal government most of the time. So a little more skeptical than people in that elite world or even people who just have one of those three attributes.
Because they don't feel like they're being heard, perhaps?
Perhaps. In fact, probably. I mean, these are people who say not only are we not being heard, my neighbors aren't being heard, my community's not being heard. They also think we have too little freedom in America. This is a sense of, wow, there's some new rule that just came down, or I'm not allowed to do this, or I can't do that. And they think the whole idea of America, freedom, equality, and self-governance, this should be a natural feature.
Children's education, that's such an important one. And I know the elitists think that, the higher-ups should always be in charge of this, but...
Right. That's a huge gulf between the elitist and Main Street. Only 13% of people in the Main Street category think that their parents have too much control over their kids' education. Overwhelmingly, 62% say they don't have enough control. And this makes sense. I mean, your children, very important, obviously. You want them to get a good education. You want the schools to be doing the right things for them.
But you want to feel like you're part of the dialogue with the schools.
That's right. And used to be, schools would always want you to be involved.
Yep.
So what about this? This is an issue we talk about a lot because there is an elite view, a progressive view that is way out of touch with America. On Main Street, 75% say biological male who considers himself a woman should not be allowed to compete in women's sports.
I don't think I'm a mean person, but this just seems like common sense.
There's physical dangers, there's absurd records being set. I wouldn't be surprised if in a few years a lot of these records being set by biological males will simply be erased because, again, they're not consistent with what people think of as women's sports. Well, the next issue, this one gets close to censorship and all kinds of other things we've been talking about lately. On Main Street.
The headline, who creates it?
Who creates the headline? People recognize there's fake news. They recognize you go on social media, not everything you say is true. But 64% say the biggest fear is letting the government decide what information should be allowed. What is misinformation? Freedom of the press, freedom of speech. This taps into those basic ideals.
Did that start with COVID, or is that something we've always worried about?
We've always worried about it, but we didn't always have social media. We didn't always have, the same sorts of communications. We didn't have the online world. So I think it's becoming more of a factor today, but there's always been a little bit of skepticism. By the way, most people on Main Street think not only should the government be prevented from stopping disinformation or deciding what it is, more than half say The government itself regularly promotes disinformation to promote its own agenda.
I always worry about the unnamed sources because they got skin in the game. So why are they telling you this?
They got skin in the game. And look, this is something that is just part of, again, that same idea. We need to have trust in government, but the government needs to earn that trust.
The winner, chicken dinner question, not who's going to win, but who do we think will win?
Right, important distinction. Well, on Main Street, 51% believe that Donald Trump is likely to win. Again, this is not 51% saying they're voting for him. They think he's likely to win. Only 29% think Joe Biden is likely to win, which is kind of curious because that means there's 20% who are saying either we just don't know or it's going to be somebody else. Not sure what that looks like at this current point in time. But the other thing about this, totally different from the elites. The elites, looking at the same data, hearing the same stories, think Joe Biden, overwhelmingly think Joe Biden. Edie, I think it's like when you're cheering for a sports team, even when they're losing, you can say, yeah, but we got our best hitters coming to the bat in the ninth inning or something. So you want to believe.
It's time for Rasmussen's Roundup, and on to something that really caught our attention. Recently, MSNBC published an article. The title, Biden is in a race against the clock to save the world from Republicans. And they summarized it, the EPA is churning out new climate change policies to safeguard them against a possible GOP takeover next year. It leaves a lot of questions, but let's start with this one. Climate change, yeah, or meh.
Well, actually, let's start with something tying back into what we've been discussing all day. What that suggests is if the voters want to do something and put a different team in charge, the elites are deciding they should do it their way anyhow. But as for the climate change topic, most Americans overwhelmingly believe climate change is happening. 54% say it's primarily caused by humans. Another 31% say, well, it's real, but there's other causes to it. And on top of that, they think it's an important issue. 51% say very important. Another 27% say it's somewhat important. So you've got 8 out of 10 Americans saying this is an important issue.
So what will we do to combat the issue?
The political world thinks, if there's a problem, people want the government to fix it. Not always the case. In fact, a lot of time it's not the case. When you ask about how much people are willing to pay to help fight climate change, well, about half say absolutely nothing. I don't want to pay higher costs for anything. I don't want to pay higher taxes. And then you've got another group that brings you up to about 8 out of 10 voters who are saying, I don't want to spend more than $100 a year. So in other words, yes, there's a problem. We need to find some other ways to solve it. Also, voters recognize there are trade-offs involved. Voters would think it's more important to find less expensive ways to create the energy. They think it's more important to have reliable sources of energy than it is to fight climate change. So this is people recognize there's a problem, but they're not looking for a top-down government solution.
It's interesting in a way because it's more like how China has dealt with this. They signed on to the Paris Accords and then immediately dropped that and said, no, we'll figure out how to adapt to climate change versus stop climate change. And since it's now, I think, the largest emitter including all other developed countries combined, that really makes a difference. It kind of makes Americans feel like, well, wait, you want me to do this, but you're not going to do anything?
Well, and let's talk about adapting. If water levels are rising, you're not going to stand on the beach until you're underwater. You are going to adapt. Society will adapt. And the way things typically get done in America is there is innovation coming from the private sector. Most voters are saying, yes, that's the way we're going to solve our problems. We're going to rely on innovation. When you start talking about trade-offs and innovation, though, people overwhelmingly in America believe that it is possible to find all the energy sources we need. We don't need to cut back on our consumption. About half believe we can fight climate change without cutting back on the American lifestyle. And it's because this is the way it's what they've experienced in life. They have seen these innovations come along.
And they don't want government to say, here's how we're going to fix it for you by making you do this.
Right. So voters believe climate change is real. They think it's a serious problem. They want us to address it. But that does not mean you're looking for a top-down solution. What they are saying is we want America, private sector, innovation, everyday Americans working together, and we will find the best way to make this happen.
When we come back, you will join the conversation. We get into the mailbag and discuss another news topic making headlines, Israel's war with Hamas. We'll be right back with the Scott Rasmussen Show right after this. Welcome back to the Scott Rasmussen Show. I'm Edie Hill. Before the break, we learned that nearly half of Americans think it's more important to make America energy independent than it is to fight climate change. Now, though, it's time for you to share your thoughts and your perspectives. We invite you to scan the QR code that you see in the lower part of your screen right now. You follow the link to a webpage where you can ask Scott a question about issues, challenges, opportunities, anything facing our nation. Last week, one of you suggested, how do voters see the situation in Gaza with the international pressure mounting on Israel to enter a ceasefire agreement? So what did you find out?
Well, first off, 40% of voters say the United States should still be siding with Israel. But about half are saying, well, we should either not take sides or we're not quite sure what to do. So you've got a little bit of support for Israel and more than before the campus protests started, but it's not universal support by any means. You've also got a sense where if you ask people, do you want a ceasefire? Well, the answer is, of course, yes.
Right.
Nobody likes war. But if you trade off what's more important, stopping the fighting right now or letting Israel create a situation where its security is protected, Hamas is defeated, well, 48% still say we need to stop the fighting right now. Not quite as many say we've got to let Israel finish the job. So pretty much a toss-up on that.
So slight change in those numbers.
Right.
Speaking of numbers, let's go back to the number not to forget.
The number not to forget is on Main Street. 19% of voters, only 19%, say they trust the federal government to do the right thing most of the time. And let's never forget, this is not the fault of the voters. It's the behavior of the federal government.